Okay, well, this is the second part of the basically lecture in the 19th century, following British, well, not just British, but European colonialism um, over across mostly Asia and Africa and the Middle East. So it's kind of wrapping up where we left off last lecture. Um, so can't hit like every country affected, but one of the most famous ones, and I think its fame oftentimes comes from the push for independence in the 20th century under Gandhi and Gandhi's whole movement. But before there was Gandhi, there was the colonization of India, first by the British East India Company, so by a private company, and then eventually the government itself takes it over and controls it, and kind of you get these typical images here of British wealth, British colonists, riding elephants, um, and then of British kind of incompetence over the government with certain famines that hit India in the late 19th century. Um, there was pushback, which is actually what was a transition from the British East India Company to the British Crown or the British Raj. That was kind of the government and British government in control since 1858. That happened because of the Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoy Rebellion occurred because of the this uprising among British trained Indian soldiers. It was a pretty violent affair, and that was the context for um, Britain to take over the colonization there. Okay, um, so two countries are going to play a really big role in global history from this point on. Have kind of played an outsider role in early modernity, at least in in a global understanding, is both China and Japan. So China is really kind of a story of two civilizations. Let me actually start off with Japan. Japan, as you remember, early on in the semester, um, was coming in contact with Jesuit missionaries, and then were eventually closed the country off to Europeans because of fear of imperialization, colonization. And so for a couple of centuries, they're kind of closed off. And then the U.S. comes basically barging in, demanding to start trade with the Japanese. This leads to the restoration of the Japanese emperor as a key component of Japanese history. This is the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Um, and what it meant is that the shogunates were kind of basically put under control. You have kind of a modern bureaucratic structure coming into place. Feudalism that was under the shogunate is over. And by the time the 20th century rolls around, Japan is a rising industrial military power. And you can see this in the sense of like its defeat of China in 1895, where Japan basically has claim to Korea, and then the defeat of the Russians in the Japanese Russian War of 1905, which basically tells the whole world, Japan is ready to play um, um, this imperialist game. Now, it's being supported by the British in most cases at this time. The U.S. is kind of rivals because the U.S. is the other up and coming power, especially if you think about Pacific power. By the time Japan fights that war with Russia in 1905, the U.S. already has is colonizing the Philippines, has control of Guam, Hawaii, and then its interest in the Caribbean. It's not Pacific, but you can see the U.S. is starting to now copy the Europeans. And if you think like, okay, where do we get from here to like World War II? We start to see, the movement happening. What about China? So China, like I said, it's a different story. China is more of a semi-colonial status. In fact, China is still under an emperor. This is going back way back into um, old rule. It's under the Qing dynasty, and basically all these internal and external wars go on throughout China. So much so, by the time the 19th century is closing and the 20th is going to begin, there is this agreement called the open door policy that is allows the U.S. basically to dictate that pretty much all the major powers could have a piece of the Chinese pie, as you can see in this cartoon image up here, right? All right. So unequal treaties. You have probably the most famous example of this is the Opium Wars. That's actually what allowed the British in. They use opium from India. Remember, India was colonized. So they use the opium from India, and illegally funneled it into China. And basically, the Chinese got doped up on opium. And there you see the Europeans begin to get in to into China and take control. You have the Taiping Rebellion was basically this kind of quasi-religious uprising that further shows that the dynasty, the control of from the top was weak. Um, Later on, as I mentioned, they do some type of reform, but it's really somewhat superficial. And by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you see France gaining Vietnam, and I already mentioned what Japan had controlled. So this leads to a kind of a xenophobic uprising called the Boxer Rebellion, and that's where the U.S. Marines actually intervene. So yeah, China is kind of a mess. Well, we come back to China, we'll see how China will modernize. Basically, once the 20th century rolls around, you see the push for modernization before and during and then after the major world wars. Okay, now in the realm of for Russia, as I just already kind of already mentioned, Russia lost to Japan, so that kind of like tells you what is Russia all about in the 19th century? Aren't they this like major European power? Well, yeah, but it's kind of I mean, they have such a large country, but a lot of this is not really hospitable, not really made for living, and they're only just starting to get railroads and stuff by the end of the 19th century, and that's with the help of other European powers. So really, Russia is one long story of corrupt leaders, kind of backwards leaders, and then very top-down reforms. In other words, you have these czars. That's a play on the word Caesar, but the czars basically rule as autocrats over Russia. It starts with a guy named Ivan the Terrible. So he's ruling Russia around the same time period. Queen Elizabeth is ruling over England, and it's very, very again kind of in a pre-modern lifestyle. You do get from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great an attempt to modernize, but all that's being modernized under these two is basically it's an anti-church movement. The aristocracy in Russia around the court is basically sucking up French culture, French language, and you have this big gap between them and the peasantry, who are the serfs. Russia, after defeating Napoleon in the early 19th century, Russia really has its designs to break down the Ottoman Empire and gain control of places in Asia and the Middle East. And Britain is always trying to thwart Russia in this. Eventually, it's this disastrous Crimean War that the Tsar at the time, Alexander II, decides to actually do some real reforms, and he breaks the feudalistic ties. So in 1861, same time period that the American Civil War was happening, you actually have the freedom of the peasants, the serfs. Now he's rewarded for all this by being assassinated by the People's Will, this very radical leftist group. He's assassinated in 1881. So basically, the one reformist, true reformist czar, and again, it's moderate reform, but at least it's something. He's assassinated, and unfortunately, the czars that follow up are going to be actually even more reactionary and conservative, which is one reason why you're going to get um, the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of by the end of World War One. So you're going to get this kind of like very reactionary leftist movement, radical leftist movement takes over. Um, Culture wise for Russia, it really is the novelists that are the most famous. I mean, they really are the great intellectuals of Russia. That includes Leo Tolstoy, who's over here. Tolstoy is famous for writing War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and was very influential on preaching anarchism and nonviolent resistance against the government. So his writings had a big influence over a lot of people, but specifically Gandhi in India was very moved by Tolstoy's writing. The other thinker is Fyodor Dostoevsky. That's him here. He wrote Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, among others. And I wish I could go more on Dostoevsky, but he was very much warning in his novels about the kind of very poor conditions of like prisoners, of the working class, and wrote these very searing psychological novels. So he kind of anticipates the rise of kind of like the radical Marxist left that's going to pop up in Russia, but even across Europe. So yeah, these are two great thinkers. Okay, last slide is the existential kind of pioneers of European existentialism. Now, there's a Christian track and atheist track. The Christian track is Soren Kierkegaard. He's the one that says, like, modernity has, like, basically broke down what true faith is, and that cultural Christianity has kind of taken over in Europe. And so he's really espousing this idea of people taking a leap of faith. He used the example of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac as, like, a way of saying like, hey, look, God, if you're really doing faith, you're being called out to like break down even like what we consider ethical norms. So that's Kierkegaard's approach. And then the other guy is Nietzsche, which I actually have his section where he talks about the death of God in the module. So I ask you to read that. Nietzsche basically is calling out European culture as basically taking it for granted that God is dead. He's basically saying like, well, with the Enlightenment and the modern nation state, this is this is modern Europe's God now, and that only artists know how to like react to this and realize there is no foundation thing, there is no God up in the sky that supports things, and that all religion, particularly Christianity, is about resentment, about the more powerful, and this kind of like this quote unquote Ubermensch, this artist type that's willing to just kind of embrace the nothingness, embrace the nihil, and live. And so he's touching on an idea which we're going to see a lot. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche read a lot in the early 20th century, so we'll see them again real soon.